Welcome, everyone. All right. It's Cinco de Mayo 2025, and today we have decided to start the day with some training on working with the exclusive rider sale agreement. I hope that you took the initiative and maybe printed this out ahead of time so that you have it there in front of you. You can mark it up with all kind of notes and everything else. I am joined today by my boss, Gabby Martinez, who probably has as much or more experience than anybody in filling this out. So she's going to be chiming in on some of her best practices. We may have a guest or two because I did put this on Facebook, social media, letting them know that, hey, listen, I don't care what office you're with. If you're interested in finding out more about how to properly fill this out, definitely be welcome. I would like to give the disclaimer that not if I'm not your broker, and actually technically I'm no one's broker anymore because we are team leaders now of Xtreme by LPT. But I always say, hey, listen, I'm not here giving any legal advice or any financial advice. I'm just sharing some education on best practices for filling this out. You always have other resources that you can fall back upon. Your broker, the Florida legal hotline and everything else. But today, I like teaching this form, and it's funny because I think the last time that we did something like this was 2019. I asked Gabby, I go, do you have that old video of me doing this? And she goes, yeah, here's the link. And I think some of you have probably used this in the past, and a lot of it is still relevant, but there have been some significant changes when it comes to this agreement. And I thought, hey, you know what? It's time to revisit this. One of the first things that I try to tell everyone on this training is that this is one of the easiest forms or agreements you're going to fill out. It used to be 4 pages, and now it's a whopping 5 pages. Now compare that to the as-is agreement. That's significantly more. And plus, we are going to be doing training on that area as well. But this should not stress anybody out. And what I truly recommend that you do with this is play it over and over, practice it a couple times, because what you don't want is you don't want it to be the morning of the afternoon of you needing to fill this out. And all of a sudden you say, where's that video? Where's that video? You really don't want to be that ill prepared. The other thing I want to mention is we're not going to read every single line and paragraph on this. We never get done. I feel it's every realtor's responsibility to read and reread these agreements. One of the things in our 13 years of being in business that I have found is agents do not read, period, but agents do not read the contracts. And it's scary. It really is scary because think about it. You're working with the single largest investment that most people are ever going to make. And here you are presenting it to someone to go ahead and sign. And if they point out a particular point, you may not be able to explain it. That's inexcusable. So what you want to do is you want to become as familiar as you can. Now, I don't have everything memorized. I have a lot of it memorized, but you always want to have this handy. I think that, you always want to have access to any of these agreements, especially the main ones like this one and the as-is contract. So if you have a question, you can just go ahead and refer to it. So let's go ahead and get started. Let's start with which one are we filling out? Well, in Florida, we operate by default as transaction brokers. When you go into a Form Simplicity or Dot Loop to go ahead and pull this agreement up, there's different versions. There is a single agent, the transaction broker. You want to make sure that you're using the transaction broker version. Secondly, this is critical, and it gets very confusing. You see at the very top there, it says exclusive right of sale. That's the one you want to use, because there's one called the exclusive brokerage, and it throws people off. You see exclusive and you think, okay, this is the right one. No. The exclusive brokerage one gives the seller the right to sell the property themselves and not pay any commission at all to the brokerage. You want to use the exclusive right of sale because of the level of protection that it gives. So let's start at the very, very top with the seller's information. One of the things that you never do is assume that everything the seller is telling you is accurate. I call that trust but verify. You need to have the property appraiser site for whatever county you're in on bookmark, because you always want to make sure that everyone that's on title signs this agreement. You cannot have a married couple and both of them appear on title and one of them signing this listing agreement and the other one isn't. That is a recipe for disaster. So you always want to make sure that you are putting everyone's name on there. Now, there could be some situations where, for example, the spouse passed away and there's right of survivorship, there's joint tenancy there, and the other spouse is automatically on title on the property. Okay, that's different. And in those scenarios, you definitely want to have a copy of the death certificate just in case a title company needs it. You may have a situation where the seller is a trust. We're seeing more and more of that happening now. Okay, perfect. Get a copy of the trust. Find out if which trustee is authorized to sign, and that's the trustee that you want to have sign. If it doesn't indicate one particular one, you may need to default to having all of the trustees sign the agreement just to be safe. But normally the title company is going to want a copy of the death certificate, a copy of the power of attorney. We see that happening as well when someone has a power of attorney. Get a copy of that power of attorney because it has to be either a general purpose one or that gives you full right to even list and sell a property. We want to verify that because not all powers of attorneys are created equally. Also, keep in mind that you could have a power of attorney, but if the person that gave the power of attorney to somebody else passed away, then the power of attorney is no longer any good. Okay, the power of attorney dies with that person. So we just want to make sure that we start off the right way by having the appropriate sellers up there. Brokerage. Now, we are not, you never, ever going to put in this line, you're never going to put Xtreme by Lpt Realty. Please don't do that. By now, everyone should know that Xtreme by Lpt is our team name. Our team name. It is not the brokerage. The brokerage is Lpt Realty. So make sure you're putting Lpt Realty on there. Now, notice the wording, authority to sell. Seller gives broker the exclusive right to sell the real and personal property, collectively property described below at the price and terms beginning. For a contract to be valid, you have to have a beginning and an ending date. Okay, you can't leave these blank. Beginning and ending date. Now, folks, we see all types of agreements come through. Gabby and I, in our 13 years, we've seen some crazy stuff. And it's amazing how poorly some of these things are filled out. And if you leave these things blank and there's no definitive starting and ending date, it's not enforceable. Now, the question will come up because one of the things we're also going to discuss today is strategy. We want to go ahead and say, hey, this is not just about this is what you put in this blank, but we want to go ahead and say, well, here's what you ought to consider when you're going to decide on this is there any predetermined number of months or days that a property should be listed for? No, that's completely negotiable. I'm a firm believer that it should be at least 3 months, preferably 6 months. Now, in the case of a short sale, we typically right out of the gate, we put it as a year. Because it doesn't matter either. In less time than that, we would have gotten the property listed and sold and done and approved, or they would have lost the property anyway. So for short sales, I automatically do a year. Sellers aren't going to argue with you about that because of the fact that, you know, they're losing their property anyway. Now, on a regular sale, how much time do you need? What are the days on market? You know, study the days on market. Okay, what is the days on market telling you? Is it 120 days? Well, what about this? Are you pricing it too high? Let's face it, many of us are taking overpriced listings. We could have an entire discussion on that. And, you know, I've always stated there's nothing wrong with padding a little bit and putting it up there a little bit, just to go ahead and make sure that the seller feels that no money was left on the table. But one of the nasty habits in our industry is that agents will take significantly overpriced listings because you want that listing so badly. And guess what happens? It doesn't sell, you know, especially as the market has changed. This is no longer 2020, 2021, when anything and everything sold immediately. Now we have significantly more inventory. Days on market are there, and the buyers are more discriminating as well. The buyers are definitely taking a look at what they're asking and what is included in the property. Has the property been renovated and all that? So it's a tougher market. always push to go ahead and get the longest period possible. Let's say, for example, your standard is 6 months. Most people are going to be, okay, 6 months. And the person says, well, you know what? This is something that Gabi shared with me. She goes, let's say the person says, well, listen, I don't want to put it in the MLS for a month because there's renovations and there's all kind of repairs that we want to make, curb appeal kind of stuff. Okay, then add a month to the agreement. Because why would you go ahead and lose a month? If you started with 6 months and they wouldn't let you put it on the market for 1 month, you just lost a month. The same thing could be true with someone that significantly overprices the property. If the person says, well, listen, let's go ahead and try it. And you did it for 6 months and they started $50,000 over and they're taking their sweet time. What good does it do if you eat up 3 months of that agreement with an overpriced listing? I look at it this way. If I want 6 months and the person says, well, I want to try to sell it for this much higher, he says, well, listen, I'll tell you what, let's meet halfway. We'll go ahead and try it, but we're going to add a month or two to the listing agreement because the reality is the market will probably tell you it's not going to sell. And I can't lose that marketing time on the agreement. Okay. Now, as far as the terminology, this is the one that basically states that whomever sells the property, it could be the seller selling it to the neighbor next door, we get paid. So this is the one that you absolutely positively want to share. Now, what we're going to do is I will pause from time to time for questions. Please, this is not a personal training session. This is not about one person asking 17 questions about this. This is about trying to keep this flowing and moving, and the questions can be addressed at a later time. But if I get to the point where I feel like I'm being bogged down by too many obvious questions that have already been answered, or it's one or two particular individuals that are trying to say, hey, listen, make this a personal training for me, I won't acknowledge that person's raising of their hand or anything else. Description of the property, get the right address. Make sure you get the right address. Sometimes we take shortcuts and we don't put the right addresses in there, or we're missing a digit. The legal description, you get that right out of the tax appraiser site. Now, so for example, some of these forms like Form Simplicity, maybe even Dot Loop, I'm not an expert on Dot Loop by any means, sometimes can auto-populate this information. So that's good. It cuts down on the number of times you can make a mistake. I've seen from time to time where the legal description is so incredibly long that it's not going to fit into the area. And then you see next to it, it says, see attachment. And that's where you can check that off. And you can go ahead and say, have a Word document or something, and you copy and paste it. As you might say, see attachment exhibit 1. And exhibit 1 at the top of the attachment is the legal description, and it's a big old whopping legal description like this. That would be the proper way to handle that scenario. Let me go ahead and pause real quick here. I am going to move quickly because I know that it's hard on Zoom, but you're going to get the recording of this, so you'll be able to play it over and over again. Any questions about what I've covered so far? Okay. All right. Personal property that is included. If it's a lot of personal property, like say they're selling it furnished, it's better to go ahead and put it in an attachment format. Now, including appliances, what you want to make sure is that you list everything that's included. And what you definitely have to do is you have to take a moment to look at the as-is contract to see all of the items that are automatically included in that. So for example, if unless otherwise stated, the refrigerator, all of these items are going to be included in there. Now, sometimes the seller is not going to include something. Let's say that they bought a brand new spanking Sub-Zero refrigerator that cost them $4,000, and they're saying, no, that's not staying. Okay, then that's imperative that you go ahead and indicate that in the additional remarks. But here's what you want to indicate: any items that are not fixed to the property that is going to be included with the sale. And then you cover yourself in the additional terms by making sure that if there's something that's not included, it's listed. You may have someone that has an amazing chandelier or something. Okay, that is a fixed. Okay, but you want to make sure that those are itemized in the additional remarks. But we're talking about personal properties here. Is the washer and dryer being conveyed? Is the washer and dryer not being conveyed? That's usually what causes a lot of confusion, especially during the walkthrough. Occupancy, check one or the other. Is it or is it not currently occupied by a tenant? And if occupied, when does the lease expire? And just keep in mind, anytime it is occupied by a tenant, there's certain rights that have to be respected as far as showing the amount of notice that's going to be given, whether a lockbox can be put on there or not. There are many, tenants that will not cooperate. Okay, they're simply not cooperating, and it can make it very difficult. Those are the situations where maybe if there's only a month or so left on the lease, I might go ahead and I would take the listing. But not put it in the MLS for that month, extend the agreement by a month, because I'd rather have the tenants out of the property for us to go in there and see how bad or how well maintained it has been before putting it on the market. The price. Well, the strategy behind the price is something that would take a completely other class, but whatever price the seller has agreed to list it for, that's the number that goes on here. Financing terms. What is the seller willing to consider? Have you ever seen a seller say no to cash? I haven't. Conventional financing, seldom, if ever. Where we run into a problem is with VA and FHA. And what happens is there's some properties that you simply can't put VA or FHA because they're condos. A lot of the condos are not approved for VA or FHA financing. It also could be a situation where maybe the person went ahead and made some enhancements to the property, maybe an addition, or they converted a garage, and they feel that, okay, it's not going to be approved by FHA anyway. Just keep in mind that they could have the same issue with conventional. What concerns me is when people don't say yes to VA, as an example, because of ignorance or lack of information. There's a lot of old information circulating out there as far as what is the seller's responsibility in a VA scenario. But, apart from that, there is no good reason why someone would not give an active military or veteran, someone that is or has served our country, the opportunity to go ahead and purchase this property. And the FHA side, there have been some issues about whether this is discrimination, because you're talking about a type of financing that is normally used by a certain socioeconomic segment of the population. And are you discriminating against that? So at the end of the day, if they can get financing and they can get approved that they can close, unless it's just not available because it's a condo, I don't see a reason why these four should not be checked. Seller financing, you don't see that very often. It's most of the time, I think it's because the agent never even brings it up as an option. But as you start seeing more and more people retiring, and maybe they lived in the property a significant number of years, and maybe they own it outright. If they don't need all the cash at one time in one lump sum, there are probably some significant tax advantages to them extending financing to these individuals. And think about it. That person may say, I don't care about an appraisal. If you're willing to finance it, that seller could get more for the property. they would finance it at typically a higher interest rate because of the risk involved than what the regular interest rate is on the market. They can make it where it's interest only for 5 years, for 10 years, and then it's all due and payable in a balloon payment, because at that point, there's probably no reason why those buyers would not be able to refinance and pay off the seller in full. So yeah, a seller is not going to finance it for 30 years. A seller is typically going to do interest only, maybe a point or two above normal interest rates, and it's going to be for 5 years or 10 years with a balloon payment. Now, is there a risk associated with the seller? Yes. And, again, we're not there to give them financial advice. You would go ahead and refer them to a tax professional or maybe an estate planning person. But keep in mind that they would hold a lien against the property. So if these buyers were to default on the loan, then they would have the opportunity to foreclose on that property and take that property back. So these are scenarios that can be very advantageous to someone that is maybe in a position that they could extend that to somebody else that normally would not. Okay, assuming of an existing mortgage for years, this has been so ignored. It's not funny. And you know what's funny? That when I was looking at the watching the replay of the 2019 session that I did about this, I even talked about it then and said when mortgage rates were low, so incredibly low, no one ever thought to go ahead and assume a mortgage. Most mortgages are assumable, including FHA and VA. So if the mortgage is assumable, okay, that's the first thing you want to verify. If it's FHA, for sure. If it's VA, for sure. Even if it's not a veteran, conventional may or may not be. This could be an amazing option to offer. Here's an example. When somebody assumes a loan, a mortgage, they are essentially taking over, and it requires lender approval of that, and paying the difference to the seller so that the seller has some cash. So let's say there's $50,000 difference between the loan amount and the sale price, and the buyers are in a position where they can hand that money to the buyer, to the seller, and have the property. Well, keep in mind that someone that is an FHA purchaser now would probably not be a good candidate to assume that mortgage, because are they going to have $50,000 in cash to go ahead and pay the difference to the seller? Probably not. But let's take a look at some of the interest rates that are out there. Let's say there's an FHA loan that was created, that was done in 2021, and it's for 2.5%, 3%, right? Let's say you have a buyer right now, a very qualified buyer with enough cash, and they're trying to get conventional financing, and the financing is 6.5, 6.75%. Well, what if they could assume that FHA mortgage that's in place right now, and they have the cash to pay the seller the difference? Especially if prices start to go down, or that person maybe was behind on their payments and they ate away a lot of their equity. It's a very doable situation. Now, it's more complicated because it has to be approved by the current lender. There's a whole process that's there. Now, if they're working with a lender now to try to get financing for the property, that lender will probably do everything they can to talk the person out of doing this. Why? Because they're not going to make any money. They're not originating that loan, so they're not incentivized to do it. But it could be very well in the best interest. So find out, is it assumable? Is it not? Does it require approval of assumption? 99% of the time it's going to be yes. to do that. So then take a look and read this at your discretion. Let me check over here, the chat area. Yeah, it is a tremendous selling point, and especially now. And that's what I had said in 2019. There may come a point where that it becomes a huge selling point, is that they have an FHA loan that is assumable, and maybe the price difference between, maybe it's someone that bought 3 years ago, they haven't had a chance to build up tremendous equity yet, and it becomes doable. Now, 3C. Do you guys remember a time when, if during 2020, 2021, and everything else, we would never even consider putting anything in here? The sellers didn't have to do anything to help that property sell, right? It was just put it on the market, 20 offers later, it's done. But now things have changed. And now more and more sellers are willing to offer concessions, right? And the buyer can decide what to do with those concessions. The buyer can decide to use the concessions to pay the buyer broker's commission. But what if the seller is willing to buy down the mortgage so that the interest rate can be lowered by a point or two to make the property even more affordable for the buyers? It just so happens, and again, somebody 6 months from now or whatever is going to say, oh, okay, I missed it. But as I'm teaching this week, I believe, our mortgage company, in-house, Revolution Mortgage, is teaching a class on buy-down mortgages. Buy-down mortgages are something that every single agent needs to know enough about to see if it becomes a viable option for these buyers. It could help that property sell much more quickly. Get in the habit of not leaving blank spaces. Whenever possible, if nothing applies, put NA. Blanks can be problematic, okay? Number 4, broker agrees to make diligent and continued efforts to sell the property in accordance with this agreement until sales contract is pending, okay? This includes, except when not in the best interest, cooperating, communicating with other brokers. All right, what if you have a scenario where an agent takes a listing and does nothing? I mean, let's face it. Unfortunately, we have different standards in our industry. The agent doesn't do anything to promote the property apart from the MLS, does very, very little, okay? Isn't doing any open houses, isn't really communicating with the sellers properly. And a month or two into the listing agreement, the seller comes up and says, I want to cancel the agreement. Now, at the time that I and Gabi and I were the brokers, thank God it never happened that often. But if it came to a situation where the sellers are like, I want to talk to your broker and I want to cancel this, I'm going to hear that person out. The person will say, well, this agent hasn't done anything. They never show up. They haven't called. They haven't done whatever. You know what I would do in that situation? I go, okay, well, listen, here's what I need to do. I need to talk to that agent because I want to make sure that I'm getting their perspective as well. And I would go to the agent and say, is any of this true? Do you have a record of the different communications you have done? And what happens is many times the agent did not make a diligent and continued effort to try to sell the home. They just listed it, put it in the MLS, and then hoped and prayed that it would sell. That's not going to hold. So make sure that you have a record of the different communications that you are having with the individuals so that if push ever came to shove, you can produce an entire history of communications with them. Number 5 is basically authorizing them to authorizing you to put it in the MLS, okay? And there are rules associated with that, more on that later, but you are authorizing that it goes into the MLS. 99% of the properties are going to go in the MLS because it is typically in the seller's best interest to have about 60,000 other hungry agents trying to sell that property for them as well. So that's page 1 of 5. any questions on anything we've covered so far? Ricardo wrote, so new buyers can have assumed the same interest rate? Yes. If the loan is assumable and the current lender approves it, they are stepping in at whatever current interest rate they have, which can be a huge savings. And again, I think the typical perfect candidate for that is someone that would normally have purchased conventional. They have a significant amount of cash to put down, but they're not excited about paying 6.5% interest, but they would be all over offering, being able to take over 2.5%, 3% interest. And a good point here, if seller offers financing, who writes the terms? Well, when you go up here, you'll see that under seller financing, you are going to put on here how much they're willing to finance. Okay, it could be a percentage. It could be a percentage amount. So let's say the seller says, well, listen, I'm not comfortable doing 95% financing, but I would be okay with doing 90% financing, whatever that is, with the following terms. The terms are going to be, say, 8% interest, interest only, 5 years, balloon payment in 5 years. Those are the basic terms, right? The amount that's being and then the terms. Now, what happens then is the note needs to be created by an attorney. It's a note that's going to have to be created by an attorney, and then the parties sign that note, and that note gets recorded. We do not go there. We are just basically giving the basic information for an attorney to go ahead and step in and create the note. For the assumption of mortgage, we should have the seller call. Okay, so the lender won't talk to you because you're not on the note. So yes, that is a question that needs to be asked. And that's usually, again, in the case of a conventional loan, on whether it's assumable or not. FHA and VA are. But to be safe, you want to have the seller have that conversation with the lender. If it is assumable, then yes, you would list that information in the MLS because it becomes a selling point. It becomes a huge selling point. And the reality is you don't see it that often right now because the agents don't know to ask that question. The agents simply didn't know that that was an option. And I think it's time that more and more agents realize that it is, and that could help a whole lot of folks be able to afford to buy in this market. Okay. All right, let's move on here to page 2. Okay, 6, broker authority.
I'm
Seller
sorry, Tony.
authorizes broker. I'm sorry,
I'm
what?
I'm sorry to interrupt. Before you move on, I had a
Yeah.
question on if the seller is a trust. I just wanted to clarify that. How do we manage that on the agreement in the first line?
The first line, you put the name of the trust.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay. And then it's going to be signed by the authorized trustee. And you'll want to get you want to also obtain a copy of the trust. Okay.
Thank you.
Sure, absolutely. Now let's take a look here. So what are they giving you authority to do? Market the property. Okay. And that also includes in the MLS. Now here's some areas that you don't necessarily want the seller to check the box. Most sellers are going to be absolutely fine with putting the property in the MLS. Some of them are going to have issues, okay? And I can understand. What if it's maybe a celebrity, or in certain situations, they say, yeah, display the property on the internet, but don't put the street address on there. You could have those situations. So this is something that unless the seller says, well, I really don't want my address out there for the whole world to see, you leave this alone. You do not check this, okay? Now, what I have seen agents do is put check marks where check marks don't belong because the agent did not properly read the questions. Kind of like, remember when you were taking the exam and they try to trick you by say, which one does not apply, and you got it mixed up? That's the way it is here. So for example, take a look at this. On 6B, seller does not authorize broker to display property on the MLS. Leave it alone. If they're authorizing it, then you don't put anything there at all. Okay. Now, let's say the person says, I don't want it in the MLS. I go, why? Why wouldn't you want 60,000 very hungry agents to see it? No, I just don't want it. Okay, so what you are basically saying is you want a pocket listing. Well, understand that that comes under certain rules. And take a look at the very next one here. It says, seller understands and acknowledges that if a seller checks this box right here, a for sale will not be placed upon the property, and seller understands and acknowledges that if a seller checks this one, broker will be limited to marketing the property only to agents within the broker's office. Pocket listings are not intended for you to try to get both sides and keep the information away from the general agent population. Okay. When somebody says, I want a pocket listing, if you could sell it within your office, that's fine. Then you're only allowed to market it within the broker's office. Now, here's my interpretation of this, right? When we were Xtreme International and we had a couple hundred agents, you could only market it within Xtreme International 200 agents. Technically speaking now, we're Lpt Realty, right? So that could be 15,000 agents because it's marketed within the brokerage. I still don't believe that that's in the client's best interest, but we have significantly more exposure in a proper pocket listing scenario where a lot more people than just a couple of hundred are seeing it. Now, imagine if it's a small brokerage and they only have 10 or 15 agents, that's little to no exposure at all. And we're getting the initials of the seller. The seller has to, in other words, we're making it overly clear. You understand the consequences, the negative impact that this could have on selling the property. And we want them to go ahead and sign to that effect. Okay. Check here. Lock boxes. Check if applicable. Use a lockbox system to show and access the property. A lockbox does not ensure the property security. Okay, that's a disclaimer there. Seller is advised to secure or remove valuables. Now, I am a huge believer in the electronic lockboxes. I cannot stand it when a real estate agent, because of $100 or less, does not use an electronic lockbox there. And that happens. I don't think there's any scenario where an agent should use the combination lockboxes, the old-fashioned lockboxes. Because what happens is people share that with everybody, and anybody and their brother can go in there and get that and go in. Okay, somebody needs to mute themselves there. Okay, so the electronic lock boxes are amazing because you can put, I think it's called a CVS code on there. You can make it very difficult for someone to get in. They have to get a special code. That prevents someone from just, sharing it with anybody. You can program it so it doesn't let the person come in too early or too late in the evening. It gives you a record of everybody that's shown the property. Use the electronic lockbox. And I think that you should have it with you in the listing presentation. You should have one with you in a listing presentation. So here's what typically happens, right? The agent doesn't ever think that they're ever going to get a listing. I'm sorry, they don't. Or they think someday when I might get a listing, I'll go buy the lockbox. You know what? Why don't you just go ahead and tell the universe that you are going to get a listing, go get the lockbox ahead of time, and have the lockbox there as part of the listing presentation so you can demonstrate to them how it works and how it provides as much security as possible and why it's advantageous to them. Keep in mind, as always, why is it in your best interest? I've never been a fan of agents that get locked into having to personally show the property. I think that you can work around that. I think that there's some scenarios, but I've never seen an agent happy about having to go meet the a buyer's agent every single time the property is going to be shown. Why? What is there? I mean, are they works of art? Is it a Rembrandt on the wall? What is the problem there? Because it creates more undue stress to you and it's limiting your ability to do your job. I'm not saying that there are not scenarios where you don't do that, but by and large, it should be. I remember teaching a class one time and there's an agent and now it's blown up like crazy. They have an amazing team and he would go to every showing. I go, why are you doing that? Well, I think that, well, no, you're just limiting yourself. You're not leveraging the tools that are available. What else could you be doing with your time instead of sitting there waiting for an agent to show up? Now, the next two, I highly, highly recommend that you put a check mark by these. Okay. I cannot stand it when I see these unchecked. Number one, withhold verbal offers. You know that we as real estate professionals are required to submit all offers, including the ridiculous one on the phone that says, yeah, I'm an investor, see if they'll take $1.50. Okay. Unless it's been already in writing as part of the listing agreement, they're telling you, seller, authorizes agent to not submit any offers below a certain amount. But apart from that, I don't want to have to be, I want the option if I want to, but I don't want to be forced to pass on every single ridiculous verbal offer that comes in. And you won't have to if you check this box. The next one is also very important. Do you know that even after the property goes under contract, you must submit all offers that come in? Do you think I want to do that? So that my seller can say, hold on, is there any way I can get out of this one so I can accept this one instead? So guess what I want them to check? Withhold all offers once seller accepts a sales contract for the property. You see how that makes perfect sense? Does everyone understand that? That's critical, critical, critical. Okay. Now, I don't know. Gabi was working on. Gabi, are you on the call? Is there anything you want to add at any point so far here?
I'm here. I'm here. I'm
Okay.
sorry. I'm on mute, so yeah.
Okay. But I don't want you to yell at me later that I monopolized the whole training. So is there anything you want to add to this point here?
No, you're perfect.
Oh, I'm perfect. I know, honey, but let's just keep it business-like right now, okay?
Okay.
Okay. The other two here, I always want the sellers to check these two. You see, I went from, oh, I want them to check this. I want them to check this. I want them to not authorize me. In other words, I don't want to put it in one of those, give permission to one of these websites that's automatically giving some kind of a bogus valuation, right? Some kind of valuation, automatic estimate of the pricing, because it can throw everything off in terms of the buyer's perception of that property. And I also don't want any other third parties to be able to comment or review about that property. So as a matter of process, I always have these two checked. Okay. Now, the seller obligations, we don't really have to get into all that right now. You guys could read this. And again, you should read it and reread it and reread it. I would like to talk about G. It says, make all legally required disclosures, including all facts that materially affect the property. So here's the thing, the seller is required, if they know, to share anything and everything that could materially impact the sale of that property. Liens, defects, code violations, all these things. What I have always preached is that in that space, you put see seller's disclosure. See seller's disclosure. Because I'm always going to strongly recommend that the seller complete a seller's disclosure. Now, one of the things that confuses agents is they think a seller's disclosure form is mandatory. You could have a buyer's agent that says, I want to see the seller's disclosure, just they don't have one. Well, it's mandatory. No, it's not. What's mandatory is that the seller disclose any material facts. And that could be done any number of ways. It could be done right here in this line. Now, is it a good idea for them to do the seller's disclosure? Absolutely. What are most of them going to put on there? Unknown, 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 unknown. Now, in case you've never done this before, under no circumstances, none, do you ever fill out a seller's disclosure for them? Never. I like to leave it with them on the day I take the listing and say, look, take a couple days to fill this out. I'll pick it up when I come take photos of the property. And have them take their time filling that out. But if I start asking the questions and fill it out, well, you know what? I'm not an attorney, but what if they commit fraud? And I now have complicity in that because I was assisting them with the completion of that form. Not doing that. Any questions about page 2 of 5?
What's 0.3% out of
We good? Okay. Now, just because at the very beginning I said I don't want a bunch of questions, didn't mean I didn't want any questions. So let's distinguish between the two. And I know that sometimes I come across more gruff than I should, but I rather you ask a question or two than not ask anything at all, because when you have as many people as you have on the call here, I find it very hard to believe that there are no questions. So, let's make sure that we
Tony.
have clarity.
Tony,
Talk to me.
okay, when you check 81 and 83, you also have to put it on the MLS when you are putting the listing. You don't just check those and then believe that it's automatically going to happen. You have to input that information on the MLS, or otherwise, it defeats the purpose.
You're absolutely right. Thank you. Yeah, what happens is this is your proof of why you check those off in the MLS. Thank you, Ricardo. Yeah, because this in itself does not translate that information to the MLS. That becomes part of the input process. So thank you for sharing that. Okay, all right. So we're good. Now we're going to get to the fun part. Okay, someone needs to be muted because I'm hearing background noise. Compensation. Okay, this is a delicate conversation. Okay, so we're going to do this the right way so that it doesn't come back to haunt us. Okay, commissions have always been and always will be negotiable. Okay, let me see here. Okay, yeah,
I did.
okay, thank you. Now I want to jump here because this section here, section 10 did not exist before. Section 10 did not exist before. Now we have to indicate there's a method to my madness. I want to talk about this section here and then bounce back to here, and I'll tell you why. Let's say the seller is willing to pay something toward the buyer broker side. Okay, that amount's negotiable, but they're willing to pay. Fantastic. What we have found is most are willing to pay. Most are willing to pay. So let's take a look at the 3 options, because this didn't exist before. Seller authorizes broker to offer compensation to buyer's broker in the amount of X% of the purchase price or a flat amount. Okay, I hardly ever see a flat amount. So put NA there. You're going to put a percentage here. Is it 1 sandwich? Is it 2 sandwiches? Is it 3 sandwiches? Whatever
Tacos.
that number
Today
is.
is tacos.
Okay, 1 taco, 2 taco, 3 tacos. You know, what are they paying there? But see, here's the thing. This is why I wanted to jump to this side first. This compensation will be set. Okay, okay. This amount, let's say it's 3 tacos. This amount will be paid from broker. This is the listing broker, LPT Realty, to buyer's broker from the compensation amount agreed to in paragraph 8. Okay, this compensation will be set forth in a separate written agreement between broker and buyer broker. All right, 2 things there. This is referencing an amount that was placed in paragraph 8. Well, that's what this comes in. See, if the way I would do this is I'm having the conversation about compensation to the agent, the seller. So this is how I would do it. I would go ahead and say, well, how much is it going to cost me, Tony? And it says, well, as you could tell, based on what I've shown you, I have a pretty extensive marketing plan. And you know that we're going to leave no stone unturned to make sure that your property gets the most exposure. And we're going to try to get it sold as quickly as possible for the most possible. On my end, on the listing side, I'm going to work for, I don't know, let's just call it 3 tacos. That's on the listing side. So on the listing side, my compensation, and that only happens if we're successful, is 3 tacos. Now, that does not cover the other side. And you may have heard and everything else, but you're not responsible. You're not required to pay anything to the broker side. Now, should you? Yes. Why? Well, because what happens is that many buyers are barely able to scrape enough money together to go ahead and get the down payment and closing costs. If they have to pay or come up with the money, I don't know, anywhere from 10 to 15,000, whatever that number is to the other side, it's just not going to make it viable for them. You have a lot of buyers that are giving their agent authority ahead of time to not even show them properties where the seller is not offering compensation to them. Yes, the agent cannot show your property if the buyer is authorizing them to do so. So I think it's in your best interest to be willing to go ahead and pay so that your property can get the most exposure, have the most people trying to sell it, and we can try to get it sold for the fastest amount, for the quickest time, and most amount. My recommendation is that you offer X amount to the other side. And again, all this is negotiable. You might be tempted to go ahead and say, well, let me try to get more from my side and less to the other side. Is that really the best business decision to make? Because again, agents are going to call and say, are you offering compensation on this? And you're either going to say yes or no. Or you're going to say, well, it depends on the offer. And I wouldn't recommend that. I think that for a lot of people, that turns them off and they won't even show the property. The seller should be on board with not paying or paying a certain amount. Okay. And that amount is predetermined. And let's face it, agents are always going to be agents, whether it's ethical or not. They're going to go ahead and okay, let's say, for example, that they go ahead and tell they get a buyer broker agreement and they put on the buyer broker agreement that they're willing to work for no less than 3 sandwiches. And the buyer is now responsible for responsible for paying that amount. But the buyer doesn't have that kind of money. So the buyer is saying, well, I'll tell you what, then I guess don't show me any properties where the seller is not willing to cover all 3 sandwiches to your side. And that could significantly limit the number of agents that are going to show that property. So let's say that they are willing to pay a total of 5. Okay. Fantastic. They're willing to pay a total of 5. They're willing to pay a total of 6. That's the figure you put in A. That's the figure you put in A. Because let's say, hypothetical, they're willing to pay 6 sandwiches. You put 6 here in 8A, and then down here, they're willing to pay it, but how are they going to pay it? Do they want it handled by the brokerage? At closing, it's coming from the broker's commission. In other words, the listing office is getting 6, and the listing office is willing to give 3 to the other side. Is that how you want to do it? Great. Then indicate here that it's 10A and what amount is being offered to the buyer side. In some scenarios, the seller says, no, I'll decide at that point. And at that point, if I decide to do it, I'll pay them directly. Okay, in that scenario, 10B is what's selected. And guess what's the other option? They don't have to pay anything at all. So the person is saying, no, under no circumstances, I don't care what, I am not paying the other side anything at all. Then you check this, and the only number that you put up here is what you're earning on the listing side. Now notice it says % of the total price plus, that's where you put your transaction fee. If you're collecting $5.95, $6.95, that's where you put that number. And you're also going to have to use the unique form that we have in LPT as well. And they're going to sign to that, but they're going to have it in 2 places. Here's where you put that. Do not put that in the additional terms. Put that here. Once it's here, you don't have to put the transaction or broker fee in the additional terms. Now, most people will leave these out. And that is, most people are not even considering a lease option scenario, or maybe the person turns around and says, well, we couldn't sell it, but I decided to lease it instead. If you want to just cover your bases under 8C, you could put 5 sandwiches of the total gross lease price or something like that. Okay. So are there any questions on the compensation side? Now, keep in mind, this is not meant to be a strategy session about how to approach compensation with the seller. We did cover some of that, but this is mostly about, they say no, great. You check 10C. They say, yeah, I understand. Yeah, I figured I'd have to pay something. So what do you think? What should I be? And then that's when you determine the total amount. And then you decide down here how much is being shared, right?
Tony.
Now, question, go ahead.
Sure. Okay. So if the sellers, let's say he says, okay, no, I'm gonna pay them directly or through you. I'm gonna pay them 2.5 tacos. Obviously, we can no longer put it on the MLS, but when we have the transaction, when we have the showing require and the buyer's agent asks, we are authorized to say that amount. So sellers cannot change their mind and put their 2.5 tacos and they say, well, you know what? I changed my mind and I'm gonna pay just 1 taco. If he already put it there, he needs to stick with that, right?
Yes. Now, keep in mind that contracts are meant to be broken. A person can change their mind.
But
Now,
if we
keep in
already
mind,
told the other agent, yeah, he's paying 2.5 tacos, then because he's already there.
right. But what if? And ultimately, you understand that the seller, this information is not going in the MLS, and you are never sharing this listing agreement with the other side. Okay. You are saying the person's going to call you and say, are you paying a compensation? Yes, they are. How much? It's 2.5 tacos. Okay, that 2.5 tacos is based on what? The list price. The list price. So if the person comes in with an offer below the list price, the seller could say, well, you know what? I'm willing to go forward, but you're asking for a $25,000 deduction in price. My commission is going to be reduced from 2.5 tacos to 2 tacos. At the
Okay,
end of the day, the only way you get paid on the buyer side is not because they signed this, it's because that information is contained in the compensation agreement. The compensation agreement is everything. Make sense?
yes, Tony, thank you.
Okay. And that is why when you're representing the buyer, you're going to send a compensation agreement along with the offer. And the amount in there should be the amount that the seller's agent said that the seller was willing to pay. Now, you do have some scenarios where the agent completely ignores it, and you said that they were willing to pay 2.5 tacos and they sent 3 tacos. Well, that's going to be obviously, X'd out, and a new number is going to be on there. If you are working with a buyer and the other side has said, yes, we're willing to pay a commission to the buyer's agent, not only should you, A, include the compensation agreement with the offer, you also include the addendum that says the sale is contingent upon the receipt of a signed compensation agreement. I got a bad feeling that some of you or a lot of you are not using that addendum, because that's the only way to protect yourself. And again, we can cover that in a separate training when we're talking about addendums. But if this is news to you and you've never even heard of this addendum, then you need to go find it, because that protects you as the buyer's agent, that the seller has X number of days to send you back the signed compensation agreement and a list of terms under which the buyer can cancel the transaction if it's not received. Or the buyer can elect to say, okay, well, I guess I'll pay you the commission then. Is that clear, folks? Everybody get that? Okay.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
Section 8B, I've never understood what this option thing is. And section 8C, gross lease value as a leasing fee. Is that like if they're also wanting to put it for rent, the property that
No.
and for rent?
Well, B is for a lease with the option to buy. I think in all the years that we've been in business, only one time has that happened. So there's a special form for that. But this is a situation where if it's going to be done, you're going to get a percentage of the amount that is being put up front. And then when it closes, let's say the person has a year to exercise that option. Then when they do, if they exercise that option, you'll be able to get compensated as well. So that's for an option. That is lease with an option to buy. C is when they rent it out. So what you want to do is you want to pull up the special lease with option to buy paperwork and read it so that you kind of have a, some knowledge of it. But you don't see that often. I've never felt that a lease with an option to buy is that good a deal for the seller or even the buyer. When the market was hot, it would make the seller be beholden to the buyer for a predetermined price. Well, then guess what? What happens when the market went up by X%? They're locked into that price. Well, conversely, it could also work where it's like the buyer is not committed to a price, and guess what? The property is not worth that anymore. Also, in that situation, the money they put forward, if they do not exercise that option to buy, they never get that money back. So that's money that they're never going to get back. So that's something you read on your own and you say, oh, I get it. Now I know what Tony was talking about. Okay.
Tony, for section C, again, so let's say I have a listing, it hasn't sold, and then they say, all right, we'll put it for rent in the market as well. Do I need to go back to 8C and have them initial this, or I just create a new exclusive, a new lease
Listing agreement.
Listing agreement.
For lease. Yeah, I would
Okay.
use that. This is more of a backup in case they decide out of the blue to agree to leasing it to somebody else, a friend, a neighbor, something like that, right? And it
Right.
came out of the blue. That's the last thing you expected them to do, to do that. Well, you put a figure in here, say 5%, then you're covered. Because it came out of the blue. It was the last thing you expected. And if you don't put it on there, it could say, well, no, yeah, I signed a listing agreement for you to sell the property. I didn't sign a listing agreement for you to get compensated if you leased it. But by having that there, you're covered. How
So
often does that happen?
something
Very
there.
rarely. Okay, makes sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Now, 8D is important, and because of what happens. So let's go ahead and read this. I hate reading things. Okay, no, this is important. See, broker's fee is due under the following circumstances. If any interest in the property is transferred, whether by sale, lease, exchange, government action, or any other means of transfer, regardless whether secured by any other person. Technically speaking, it does cover you there if they decide to lease it, but have an amount up there, so the amount's already predetermined. So basically, you're going to earn your money if the interest in the property is done. Okay, let's say a bankruptcy happens. You can technically have earned your commission. Okay, doesn't matter who brought the buyer to the table, you get paid. So this is why you want to use the exclusive right of sale. Okay, now if seller refuses or fails to sign an offer at the price and terms stated in this agreement, defaults on an executed sales contract, or agrees with a buyer to cancel an executed sales contract. Okay, so what it's saying here is, let's say they listed for 400 and they put cash, and you get someone that says, okay, I'll pay you 400,000 cash, and the person says, no, I want 410. You earned a commission. We earned a commission because based on the price and terms, 400,000 cash, you procured a ready, willing, and able buyer. They elect to not sign it. I can say, well, you know, you're going to owe me the money anyway. So think about that before you walk away from this, because I've earned a commission and we're going to take whatever remedies are available to us to go ahead and receive that compensation. So keep that in mind. Now, if within X days after termination date, protection period, seller transfers or contracts to transfer the property or any interest, any process. Okay, so what happens is you have a protection period. Now, your listing has a definitive expiration date. What stops the seller knowing that it's going to expire the next day? You're showing the property to a buyer. The seller says, can I talk to you for a second? And brings the buyer aside and says, look, my listing expires tomorrow or the day after. So, you know, just come to me directly. We're going to work something out. And that way I can give you a better deal because I don't have to pay the commission to the other agent. Do you think that happens? Do you think it can happen? Absolutely. You're protected if you have a protection period. Okay. If you leave this blank, it doesn't mean 10 days, 20 days, anything. It means 0. You do not want to leave it blank. You want the longest protection period you can get. I would not settle for anything less than 90 days protection period. Okay. I would rather have 120 days. I would rather have 6 months. If this seller is operating with good intentions, okay, then this is not going to be an issue because either I'm going to get the property sold or we didn't get it sold, it expired, and that person decides to not sell anymore, okay, or they list with somebody else. Because check out the last line here. However, no fee will be due broker if the property is relisted after termination date and sold through another broker. Okay, so somebody comes to see the property. They don't make an offer during the listing period. It expires. You're in the termination period. That person contacts the seller directly, or that person working with a buyer's agent contacts that seller directly, puts an offer on the property. It's accepted by that seller. They owe you the money. They owe you the money because that buyer was procured during the time that the property was listed. Now, your property expires today. Today, they list with another broker. A buyer that came 3 days earlier wants to buy that property, you get nothing. You get nothing because your listing agreement ended and they started with a brand new listing agreement with another broker. You get nada. Does everyone understand that?
Yes, but then you will have to be looking out to see if they sold the property
Oh, yeah.
to the other agent. Now, what happens if they right away sign with another brokerage right after our listing expires?
You get nothing.
Even if you put 90 days here.
No. Well, yeah, even if you put, because the protection period doesn't protect you against the property being listed by somebody else. Okay, it protects you from the seller doing a deal with someone that was procured during the time that it was listed. Once a listing expires, it's open game. Open game. The minute it expires, every agent and their brother can contact that seller and try to list that property. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, guys. You sure you have any other questions on that part of it there?
I
So
have a question, Tony.
Go ahead.
Okay, so for 10B, let's say that the seller chooses the B option, right? The
Mhm.
seller will pay directly to the buyer's broker. So the total compensation, for argument's sake, is 5 tacos, and the seller will pay 2 tacos to the buyer's broker.
Okay.
What do we put on 8A?
You don't. Because 8A is only when the listing broker is paying the buyer broker. 8, okay, time out. Okay,
Okay,
I get it.
yes.
Coffee's kicking in. Okay. If they elect to go with 8B, 8A, you only put the amount that you're earning as the listing broker.
Got you.
Thank you for bringing that up. That's very astute of you to catch that. Yes, let's say I say, well, listen, how do you want to handle paying the other side? Well, if and when we get to it, I'll decide then, depending upon the offer. Okay, well, yeah, you have every right to do that. But you know, I'm working for 3 tacos. We are agreed that I'm going to get paid 3 tacos. Yeah, I'm going to put 3 tacos here. And then the other part is they have not even, at this point in time, since they have not agreed to any number, I would check no compensation. Now, when a buyer's agent calls me and say, are they willing to pay a commission? I go, they have authorized me to say that they will consider paying a commission based on the offer amount. What I recommend that you do is fill out a compensation form for whatever amount you're seeking and include that compensation form along with the offer. You see what I did there? I may have been actually educating that agent on what to do, because if it's an inexperienced agent and say, are you willing to pay, are they willing to pay commission? I go, well, it depends. It depends on the amount. Well, that's not really reassuring. Well, if you think your buyer is going to want this property, then why wouldn't you show it to them? All you got to do is go ahead and fill out the compensation for whatever you want. What do you want? 2 tacos, 2.5, 3, put it on there. They're willing to consider it based on the quality of the offer. And if you want to be protected, include the addendum where the offer is contingent on a compensation agreement being signed and received. You're protected no matter what. You may have that agent going, oh, I didn't know I could do that. Yeah, you could do that all day long. Make sense? Now, this one here, 8E, what happens if, as consideration for broker services, broker is entitled to receive a % of all deposits that seller retains as liquidated damages for buyer's default in the transaction, not to exceed the amount in 8A. The normal thing we put on here is 50%. So let's say there is a $10,000 deposit, and the buyer outright defaults. There's no question the money is going to the broker or to the seller, or as part of a settlement between the two parties, it's determined that the seller is going to keep $10,000 of the $20,000 deposit. Okay, all right. So what amount is the seller getting? 10,000. What does this entitle you to? Whatever percentage you have here. So if it's 50%, you're entitled to 5,000. If you left it blank, you get 0. Okay.
Tony, I have
Now,
a question.
Sure.
Tony, a previous company I worked with, a large company, had a policy that when a listing expired, that no other agent within the same company could go after that listing for like a month. I thought it was very stupid, but I wonder if there's any policy of an LPT expires, whether another LPT agent can go after that listing right away, or if there's some kind of policy. I don't know why that policy was ever instituted,
Well,
but it was kind of,
yeah, I
you've heard
get
of
it.
that.
That's
You've
a
heard of
great
that,
point.
right? It's a
That's a great
respectful.
point, Louis.
It was out of respect. It was out of respect, I guess. I don't
Yeah.
know. So that other agents knew this listing was going to expire, maybe, in-house, and they would go after other agents' listing. It was kind of like a way to, I don't know, kind of people not fighting, agents not fighting against each other in-house.
Yeah, that's exactly it. It was a respect thing. Small offices, that may be a great idea in a small boutique kind of scenario where it's like, maybe they don't want a cutthroat situation in there. They could have that policy within their brokerage. That policy does not exist within LPT, nor does it exist within the Xtreme by LPT team. Okay, we have never extended that level of respect. I hate to say it that way, but no, it's open game.
What happens was it would give advantage to all the other agencies, right? Because they would go after it, and we couldn't go after our listing.
Yeah.
It was stupid.
Counterintuitive. You're absolutely right. Yeah, none of us could go after it, but every other agent in the market could go after it. So
right.
it's
Okay,
insane.
well, good to know. Thank you.
Yeah, man, good point. Thank you for bringing that up. Okay, 9 is really about notice the seller regarding buyer broker. Okay, the buyer broker, even if compensated by the seller or broker, will provide services for the broker. In other words, you're agreeing, seller, to pay them, or hey, seller, you have agreed us to pay them. But just because the money ultimately is coming from us or you, that agent doesn't work for you. That agent works for the buyer. So that's an important clause there. Seller is advised and is aware that seller may, but is not required to, compensate a buyer broker upon closing. This is just redundancy after redundancy for protection ever since the lawsuit. Seller may choose to enter into a separate written agreement to pay buyer broker or may approve broker to pay buyer's broker in accordance. Well, we do have a compensation agreement that one of them needs to be signed. Is it seller's broker to buyer broker, or is it seller to buyer broker? One of those two, if they're paying, needs to be signed and filled out. Okay. Broker, okay. Buyer's broker may include this broker if broker also works for buyer in this agreement. Okay. So here's the thing. What happens if the seller is willing to pay X number of tacos on the listing side and X number of tacos to the buyer side? What if you as the listing agent or LPT as the listing broker gets both sides? This is telling the seller that can happen and it's okay. All right. If this occurs during the duration of this listing, broker will be entitled to the compensation in paragraph 8 for services performed for seller, as well as buyer broker compensation in paragraph 10A. So that's important that it's covered, because you're going to have scenarios where the seller is saying, well, if you got both sides, then you're going to work for less, right? No, not necessarily. Okay. Unless that is agreed upon in advance and added to the additional terms. So it's protecting you, advising them that you can legally represent the buyer side as a transaction broker, and whatever compensation was due to that side, you can get as well as what was due on the listing side. Okay, so that's a beautiful thing. All right, we've talked about 10, we covered it. Brokerage relationship, we are transaction brokers, and it tells you right then and there what our duties and responsibilities are. Make sure you have read that. Conditional termination. All right, let's talk about this. At seller's request, broker may agree to conditionally terminate this agreement. It's not working out. There's no, I mean, let's just face it. You're not getting along, whatever. If broker agrees to conditional termination, seller must sign a withdrawal agreement, right, from the MLS, reimburse broker for all direct expenses incurred in marketing the property. So let's say, for example, you take a listing, and the reason they listed the property is they were getting separated, they were getting divorced. You list the property, you go out there and you have professional photography, drone, this and that, special marketing done, and you spend $1,000 out of pocket with receipts to market that property. Now, let's say those folks come back and say, Tony, listen, we worked things out. We worked things out, and we want our marriage to continue. I'm not going to be disappointed at the fact that they worked things out. I'm pro-marriage, all right? But from a business perspective, I'm happy for you, but I'm out $1,000. You're going to have to pay that money, okay? That money is going to have to be paid. Now, I don't know if I've ever seen this happen in the 13 years of Xtreme. But if it is, keep in mind that they cannot write you a check directly. That money has to go through LPT and has to go through the normal system. You are not allowed to receive compensation on any form directly, okay? And pay a cancellation fee of, I have seen agents put 0 here. That's cray-cray. Why would
Never
you
put 0.
Huh?
Never put 0.
What do you put, Gabi?
500.
I'm sorry, Gabi, did you say 5,000?
500.
I'm sorry, did you say 1,000?
Okay, 1,000.
Let me tell you something, folks. Make it hurt. Make it hurt. Here's the thing. It doesn't matter if you put 5,000 or 1,000. you have the right to waive that. I'll give you an example. Let's say I'm doing this to protect myself from someone just being a flake. But let's say I have put 2,500 on there, right? And the person comes to me and says, hey, listen, we're working out our marriage, and is there any way that you can, terminate the agreement? Here's what I would probably do. I'm going to penalize you a cancellation fee so that you can save your marriage. No, I'll probably waive that. I have the right to waive it. I want a number there that if I feel needs to be enforced, I have the right to enforce it. So I'm not going to put anything less than probably 2,000, 2,500 on there. We used to put 1,000 back when houses sold for $250,000. Okay, so keep that in mind. Okay, so you have every right to go ahead and cancel that going forward, and it's your decision. See, the way LPT operates is very similar to the way Xtreme operated. Even though it's the broker's money, you make that call. Even though it's the broker's listing, you make that call. We don't want to bog down our state brokers. Well, can I cancel this deal? Can I waive the cancellation fee? No, we don't want that. You make that decision. Okay. Now, broker may void conditional termination, and seller will pay the fee stated in paragraph 8A, less any cancellation fee already reserved, if the seller transfers or contracts to transfer property or any interest during the time period. So let's say, for example, they were 3 months left. There were 3 months left on the listing agreement, and they came to you with this sad story. And you said, okay, we'll do a conditional termination. Okay. And I'm going to let you off the hook. I'm not going to charge you anything at all. During the 3 months that are still left on that original agreement, plus say 3 months on the protection period, if they list that property and sell it through somebody else, or they sell it directly to somebody else, they owe you the money, less any cancellation fee that you collected up front. You guys understand that? It's beautiful. Because if someone's coming to me with a story saying we're not selling because we worked out our marriage, I want to believe you, but the conditional release protects me if you are trying to pull a fast one on me. Now, there may be situations when you grant someone an unconditional release. I've done that. Let's say a seller came to me and said, your agent sucks. I never see them. They don't return your calls. They're constantly out of the country. If you don't release this listing, I'm going to file this, this, and this. You know what I'm going to do? If any of that information is true, I'm signing an unconditional release to them immediately. Go list it with whoever you want. Our deal is done. By the same token, you may have someone that's super, super unhappy with their current listing arrangement someplace else. You're not soliciting them. They're soliciting you. And they want you to be their listing agent. You can't list that property unless that person gets an unconditional release from their current broker. Does that make sense? You cannot list that property with them being under a conditional release. You cannot list it. What questions do you guys have on that? Okay. All right. Dispute resolution in advance. You're already discussing what would the process be in the event that there is a dispute, because there's 3 stages. There's mediation, there's arbitration, and then there's litigation. Ooh, that rhymes. I should do a rap. I'll come back to that. So what happens is mediation is, can we just talk about this? And by everyone here is saying by default, it's going to go to mediation. But a mediator, the decision made by a mediator is not binding. It's not binding. Okay. So the mediator can look at the situation and say, seller, dude, you screwed up. you know, you need to release that deposit immediately. The seller says, no, I don't believe it. I don't care. I'm not doing it. It's not binding. The next level up is arbitration, which is where it is binding. And there's fees associated with having an arbitration. Now, here's what I can tell you. In listening to our state broker, Natalie Cox, a few months ago, when they were talking about initialing here, she basically said that LPT is not going to be okay with arbitration because there's fees associated with it, and you're in advance authorizing them to go ahead and do it. It shows, yeah, if you sign it, you're on your own. In other words, if you say yes to arbitration, the company is under no obligation to go ahead and do it, but you can decide to do it. You can pay the $1,500 or $500 or whatever monies it's going to count for that arbitration. So typically, I would leave that blank. I will leave that blank, or the sellers can sign it, but you don't sign here. You got two areas here. See, two sellers, but do not put your initials in there unless you're willing to put your money where your mouth is. And go ahead, and then any costs associated with the arbitration is going to be on you. Okay? So that is the most. Now, here's what you're going to put in additional terms. And let me tell you something that a lot of agents don't realize. Whatever you write in additional terms will supersede whatever is already built into the contract. You do not write something in the additional terms that has already been covered in the agreement. So the number one thing you put under additional terms is property being sold as is. Property is being sold as is. That is the number one thing you put on there, because 99.99% of people are selling it as is. That's the first thing you do. The second thing you might want to consider putting in there, if the seller is saying, I do not want the property in the MLS until this date, because we're required to put it in the MLS within 48 hours, unless the seller gives us explicit instructions otherwise. So I would put that in there if applicable. Let's say you work out something with the seller that if you are both the listing broker and the selling broker, you agree to a percentage amount that is different than what's up there. So let's say normally it would be, I don't know, let's say 3 sandwiches on the listing side, I don't know, 2.5 sandwiches on this side. But let's say for some crazy reason you agree to 4 sandwiches if you have both sides, then that is broken down in here. Okay, in the event that the listing agent is also the selling agent, don't put selling broker, because the selling broker, the listing broker is Lpt Realty. And it could be somebody completely other than you from Lpt Realty. And if you put selling broker is both sides, technically speaking, they don't have to pay the commission what they did before. So don't make that screw up. This is only if the actual listing agent is the actual selling agent in the transaction. Okay. And if you want to get more specific, put your name. Hey, if Tony Martinez is the listing agent and Tony Martinez is the selling agent, then the total seller compensation amount paid by the compensation by the seller is going to be X%. And now you're covered. Okay. If there's going to be items that are specifically not included in the property, okay, break it down in here. Okay, because that means, because what happens is people, and Gabi can give you her firsthand experience on this, you got to look for things that could be problems. I'll give you an example. You look at wall-mounted TVs. Now, you can look at a wall-mounted TV and say, well, that's a fixture because it's mounted to the wall. Technically speaking, it's not. When you look at the as-is contract, the as-is contract says that the wall mounts and the hardware must stay. And I don't want to confuse you, but this is a good opportunity for this. Let's say the person says, yeah, I'm not going to take those TVs with me. They could stay. I would include that in there. Okay. You know, television sets in all rooms stay with the property. But the person says, no, 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 hell no, that 90-inch TV, I'm taking it with me and all that. Okay, that's cool. I would put on here, you know, 90-inch or all-mounted television set in living room does not stay, does not convey with the property. But you got to let the sellers know that they cannot leave a bunch of holes in the wall because they took the mount and they took the hardware that's attached to the back of the TV. That happens all the time when you go into a walkthrough. And the person goes in there, and in every room that there was a wall-mounted television, you have all of these holes in the wall. That's a major issue. Okay, so you got to say, listen, you taking the TVs or the stay? I'm taking it. Okay, just so you understand the way the contracts are written, you have to leave the wall mounts. Take the TV, but take the brackets off the back and leave the brackets there by the wall, because both the wall mount was attached to the wall and the brackets that go behind the television set, those must stay. Do you have any questions on that? Washer and dryer, do they stay? No, washer and dryer are not conveyed. You know, is the refrigerator in the back in the garage staying? No, refrigerator in the garage is not conveyed. Okay. Are all these appliances stay? All of them, yes, except that refrigerator is brand new. So I'm going to put the refrigerator that's in the garage here. I'm taking that refrigerator with me. You itemize that as well. And then, of course, you need to convey that to the other side so that there's no misunderstandings. Gabi, is there anything you want to share on this here?
No, I'm good. Thank you.
Okay. All right. So, folks, really, that's it. The only reason it took us as long as it did is because we actually combined strategy and not just what you fill out. Now, everyone needs to sign this. You sign as the brokerage. You do not, repeat, do not need to have LPT broker sign this. We are given authority to sign as the broker. By the way, in Dotloop, Gabi has already created certain clauses. So you're doing this paperwork in Dotloop. So you can go under Dotloop, under clauses, all the way at the very bottom, and various clauses that we have already predetermined could be on there are there. Now, they don't automatically load on the agreement. You have to copy and paste it. But we've already taken care of the language in many of these situations that come up on the listing side, so you don't have to think about the language. Now, remember, you put that they're paying a $5.95 brokerage fee way up there at the beginning, okay? You don't need to list it again here. You do not need to list it again here. Again, do not write things in here that can cancel out the official language that is in the agreement itself. Okay.
Tony, I have a question.
Yes.
It's back up, I believe, at 13, where we talked about arbitration, right?
Mm-hmm.
If LPT is not paying for the arbitration and we put nothing in there, yet the sellers decide to put their initials there, they're agreeing that they will be paying for the entire portion of the arbitration, correct?
That's my understanding of it. Each party to an arbitration, blah, 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 will pay its own fees, costs, and expenses. See that? We're not a party to this because we didn't agree to it.
Correct.
Okay. So at that point, we don't have a dog in the fight. We just know that if the seller wins, we're going to get paid.
Okay.
Because that's part of our agreement. Make sense?
Sounds good. Thank you.
Okay.
Tony, question, once they remove their paintings from the wall, do those holes need to be covered, patched, and painted?
You know, I wish I could say that I am a professor of the as-is. The as-is does say that the owner agrees to maintain the property and turn over the property in the same condition as it was at the time that they went under contract. All right. You have painting on the wall. Obviously, there are holes there. Okay. I think that to avoid any issues whatsoever, because let's say that legally they don't have to. It doesn't mean that it's not going to tick off the buyer. It's not going to upset the buyer, and the buyer is going to have a conniption during the walkthrough. So what I would do is guide them and say this. Now, here's something else. I mean, this sounds silly, but I would probably do this. And Gabi, maybe we should do a clause on this. Do you know that anything that can go wrong will probably go wrong? Okay, Murphy's Law on this. Okay, does a seller know that there is going to be a walkthrough the day of the closing or the day before? Okay, does the seller know that they should have everything out of the property by the walkthrough? Does the seller know that they should have all of the holes patched by that time? I would list all that here. You have sellers that it's 4 or 5 days before the closing, and they haven't packed anything, and everything is still in the property. And it's like, what are you thinking? Well, life, yeah. No, you have to be out of the property by the day of the, that's why most of the time, the day of the closing belongs to the buyer. So that as of the day of the closing, the house is theirs.
But
The seller should not have all their stuff there.
I have something to say. If
Mhm.
the holes, not necessarily, there's nowhere on the contract that stays on the assets contract. You have to add it, right? Because there's no way in the contract that states that all holes on the walls need to be patched. Most of the times, I add that on the additional terms of the assets contract whenever I see a house that has a lot of things on the walls. But that is not truly on the assets contract, so you need to be sure that you add it.
Yeah, thank you. And again, a lot of this is communication. Where is it written here that the sellers have to be out of the property on the day of closing? Not on the listing agreement. It's that on the as is, but I want to prep them. Most of the time the problems happen because A, we don't bring up what if scenarios. And B, we bring them up, but we don't document them. And then the seller said, well, you never told me I had to be out of the property by this date. What do you mean? You're selling the house. Yeah, but you never told me. I don't want that scenario to happen with me. So I want to be very, very communicative with them and have everything in writing.
So
But-
so you're saying that on additional terms, we write that the seller should be out of the property by the closing date? Just to be
by
covered?
by the closing date, by the walkthrough.
Okay.
Okay.
Tony, can I go back a little bit to where they have the TVs on the wall? Let's say the seller decides they want to take the TV, and I know the as-is contract will say the fixture. Is it okay for them to, or for us to write in the additional term that, let's say the seller will go ahead and take the TV and the fixture and patch the hole, for example? Is that okay?
Yeah, that's exactly what Gabi was talking about, that in the as-is says that they're supposed to leave the wall mounts. Okay. So they can take the TVs because the TVs are theirs. The TVs don't stay with the property unless it's indicated as such. But what they're supposed to leave are the wall mounts. Okay. Let's say you have a scenario where they're going to completely redo the place, and where the TVs are now are not where they're going to have their TVs later. Then at that point in the as-is contract, it needs to be stated that all wall mounts are going to be removed and patches and repairs made to the drywall. That's the time and place for that. And that's a completely separate agreement. That's when you're representing the buyer, not on the listing site.
Okay.
Okay. So, all All right. Took a little longer because again, we went into some strategies, but I like the questions. Did you find this to be valuable? You guys learned something? All right, so what we're gonna do is we're gonna make this recording available, and then Gabi will probably upload it into paperless pipeline.
I'm sorry, did we mention, I don't know if I missed it, but did we mention the fact that when a seller says, okay, I'm listing with you, but I need 30 days to declutter?
Yeah, we did.
Okay.
Yeah, we talked in those scenarios where they said, no, I need 30 days before you put it in the MLS and everything else. I said, no problem. Then we're going to add that 30 days to the listing agreement. Normally it would have been 6 months. Now it's going to be 7.
Yeah, I don't know if this is important, but I have added different terms, and this is something that I learned at a class that I attended. There may be situations where the seller during the listing, he may say, well, you know what, I'm going on vacation with my family. We're gonna go overseas for 25 days. I don't want any showings. So I have that situation, and now I like to add those things in my additional terms. Like in the case for each day that the property is not able to show it, an additional day, it's added to the listing agreement.
That's a
Because
great point. I mean, these things come from experience. You know, you list the
yes,
property and they go on vacation for a month. And you
yes,
can't
and
show the
not just
property.
that, yeah, and not just that. I remember seeing on a listing agreement of the class that I went for. This is a very successful top producer in another company. He even he told me to add, for any decline showing, the listing will extend an additional day or whatever. It could be up to 5 days. So you make the seller aware that he needs to cooperate with showings, because sometimes they can be like, no, you know, I don't feel well. No, I don't want showings the weekend. And then your time is running up. So if you notice that you have a situation like that, that happened to me with my recent closing. The wife was a little like on the no so many showings side, so I had to add something like that on my listing agreement. You know, so
Beautiful. I
yeah.
love it. All
So
right, folks.
quick question, one last question. I'm so sorry.
No worries.
So in this case, per what Gabby was saying, then it would make sense for us to write that ahead of time, all those things that we're thinking in the event that there is no showing or we're unable to show, then we will make sure that we show XYZ days. So then that way we don't have to ever go back to them. We
Correct.
put it up front, correct?
Oh, yeah. If it's not up front, it doesn't count. It has to be mentioned up front and it has to be part of the additional terms or it's not binding
From the beginning.
from the
Okay.
beginning.
I'm sorry. Probably a very green question, but
No, not at all. Not at all. I mean, it's listen, what you've had your license, what, 15 minutes now? So
if
you
right.
know, you're entitled to ask a lot of questions when you've only had your license a couple 3 weeks. So don't worry. By the way, this is a Nikki up there in Port Charlotte. So we have a person up there that can handle the West Coast for us now. So and by all
Awesome.
indications, she's going to be a superstar because she is doing some great stuff. So make sure you know to send any referrals up there to her.
Awesome.
All right. I think that's it, folks. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.